Welcome to the journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human.
Todd Berliner.
Yes.
Welcome to the podcast, Journey of an Aesthete.
Oh, thank you for calling.
Well, this is our show, and you're on it. And I sort of feel like, do you mind if I say a little brief introduction before we start our conversation? Or?
Absolutely. Are we on the air right now? Or
Absolutely.
Are we being recorded?
Absolutely.
Okay.
This is it.
Let's get it started.
I think my interest in you chiefly comes from one book, and that's Hollywood Incoherent, which I think is a terrific book, and actually, quite frankly, is one of the best, if not better, books I've read on 70s movies.
Thank you.
And, you know, it's inspired me, and of course, that was back in 2011. But subsequently, you've written a really terrific sort of guide to Hollywood storytelling called Hollywood Aesthetic, which is also a very good book, Pleasure in American Cinema. And you've written these books, and you're a film theorist and critic, and you teach at University of North Carolina. And your work has inspired me. And of course, on this podcast, I talk a lot about 70s movies, and I am a cinephile, and so it seems most appropriate to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it.
I'm wondering where you wanted to start, because we could usually start from a biography of how you came to write about these kinds of movies in the way that you do, and your journey with the movies you grew up with and the movies you love or didn't love, and maybe talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I began writing Hollywood Incoherent when I was in graduate school in California, and I realized this was in the late 90s. Or mid-90s. And I realized that so many of the movies that I loved the most were coming from this same period. And this is like an 8-year period from 1970 to 1977, essentially. And I would continually return to these movies. Many, by the way, came out before I was even old enough to see them. So part of it was maybe nostalgia, but part of it was, sort of nostalgia, which is, these were movies, some of which were, came out when I was, quite young, in the first grade or something. I couldn't possibly have seen them then, but I kept returning to them. These are movies by Robert Altman and Martin Scorsese and Elaine May, and movies by eventually John Cassavetes and William Friedkin and others.
Don't forget Hal Ashby.
What's that?
Don't forget Hal Ashby. Ashby and Michael.
Oh, and Hal Ashby, of course, yeah. And many others.
Yep.
Milos Forman.
Martin Ritt, yeah.
And so, and these films seemed to me so memorable and unusual for Hollywood. They seemed to have one foot in Hollywood cinema that offered them a structure, a format, a way of storytelling, but then another foot was someplace else, and I didn't know where that was. Yep. And I wanted to figure out what was going on, meaning what was going on in the film industry at the time that would allow these unusual films to be made, and then they just sort of stopped. Right? By the end of the 70s, they just sort of stopped. And you would get a few films here and there that would be working in that same vein, but mostly from Hollywood they were.
Hold that thought, because an idea occurs to me. Yeah. I believe there are a few movies that I call 70s movies that came out in 80 and 81 that have a 70s spirit, like Used Cars comes to mind by Bob Zemeckis, which seems very 70s to me. Breaking Away comes to mind from 79. And of course, Cutter's Way. Those are just the titles that come to mind. So I don't think that the spirit stops necessarily. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Right. So there are movies like that, and then there are the movies by these same filmmakers who got their start in the 70s, like Martin Scorsese comes out with Raging Bull and The King of Comedy and Last Temptation of Christ in the 80s. And these movies are, they feel like 70s movies in that same tradition. And we can talk about what that tradition is. But I wanted to know, why there are so many of them that are grouped around this, essentially 8-year period. what was going on in the industry and what defined those movies. What were the formal properties that I and so many other people were responding to that said, that was something special, that was unusual. Mm-hmm. And so that really is what set me on that investigative path, was to try to figure that out. Mm-hmm. And my conclusions are in Hollywood Incoherent, which you referenced. And so that was my initial sort of impetus for writing that book. The second book, Hollywood is Saying, did you want me to go there, or you want to stick with 70s?
Well, if it were up to me, we would talk. I don't know how much time you have. Probably not as much time as I like. We talk about 70s movies all night. Can't do that. Don't have all night. But to be fair to you as a scholar, I actually do find the writing on some of the more recent films and some of the classical Hollywood films and Hollywood aesthetic equally interesting. And I really like what you have to say about some of these Westerns and about, so I think that, so if you want to go there, I wanted to hold off a little bit on that till maybe a little bit later, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
But I think I want to emphasize that, you're an all around film scholar, theoretician. You have a lot of ideas about all sorts of things, not just the 70s, but you go ahead, talk more.
Well, yeah. So, did you want to stick with the 70s still, or should we move on, or do you want to stick with the 70s deeper?
I want to stick with the 70s a little longer because I want to think about the movie The Last Detail. Just comes to mind, and what it does with actors in a space. Just the kind of just remarkable things it does, and Shampoo. I'm just thinking. And you talk about a little bit about this in your book. It's kind of for you, it's about a new way of narrating film, right? Narratology almost, right?
Yeah. So I think what was happening in the 70s, it wasn't exactly a new way in the way that say Godard is telling stories in a new way, or James Joyce was telling stories in a new way. It was basically building on certain traditions, but emphasizing, detour, emphasizing turns away from that very linear storytelling path that Hollywood had perfected during the studio era, and exploring moral ambiguities, conceptual ambiguities, storytelling ambiguities, as well as just exploring the idea that there would be gaps in a story, that there would be things that don't make sense, that there would be scenes that don't build on the cause and effect structure.
Right. The question and answer quality of traditional or classical. Classical narrative. And what comes to mind, and of course, you mentioned The Exorcist. There's so much time spent in Friedkin's film with the lives of these priests that have absolutely nothing to do with the horror plot. Jason Miller getting drunk with his friend. And is that part of what you're talking about, these kind of digressions away?
Yeah, it is. The Exorcist is a really good example because The Exorcist is like an art film. Totally. Here you have this, essentially it's an exploitation film, right? Big budget exploitation, which Hollywood had really embraced in the 70s.
That's right.
With films like Jaws and Towering Inferno and others. But here you've got, big budget exploitation film, and it's got all sorts of gaps in it. Scene transitions are even odd. You move from one thing to another. You don't even know how you got there. You don't know the temporal relations between scenes. Is this the next day? Is this at the same time? Is this, a week later? And then spatial relations are also sort of strangely incoherent in that movie at times. And then there's off-screen action, and you hear about it, and you're like, well, where was that scene?
That's right.
And so, it's a big budget film, and yet here it's exploring all these oblique storytelling techniques.
And you're saying that this was endemic to all 70s, most 70s films.
No, I wouldn't say that. So if you actually just counted movies, most of them are very traditional from that period. But what happens in the 70s is that there's this other type of movie that becomes very popular, this more oblique storytelling that I'm discussing, that becomes very popular and is appearing in really big budget movies like The Godfather Part 2 and The French Connection and The Exorcist and movies like that. Right. And also that you just, that it's appearing in big budget movies. And also there's just so many of them from that period. And so many of the movies we remember from that period, like Chinatown and Shampoo and Cabaret and others, they are exploring these oblique techniques.
It's interesting. I think about one of my favorite directors, Michael Ritchie, his movies in the 70s like Semi-Tough and Prime Cut and Smile are highly unusual movies. And lo and behold, when he starts making movies in the 80s, he seems to move away from that, like Fletch and The Golden Child. There is a change there, and I can't help but think is part of that.
Yeah, that's true.
Part of that change.
Yeah, and he made one of my favorite movies from the 70s, which is The Bad News Bears.
Yep.
1976 film.
Love that film.
That is really unusual. First of all, it's about kids that are, and he's drinking, he's yelling at the kids, and the main character, who's played by Walter Matthau, never really redeems himself. It's a strangely, dark film for what we think of as a kids film.
It is, and it has an opening that's more like The Long Goodbye. Elliot Gould. That opening of the main character, instead of in his bed, he's looking for cat food. He's in a car, and it stays.
Right. Like The Long Goodbye. Yes, right. That's true.
It's interesting, and I guess the representation of heroes or anti-heroes is important in this too, right?
Yeah. Well, also he made The Candidate in, I think it's 72. And that movie is also unusual because it's got, Robert Redford, who's a leading man, gorgeous, he plays a senator. But, you as the movie goes on, you start to, question whether this wholesome guy is really in it for the right reasons. And then it has one of the most interesting and ambiguous endings, which is also a characteristic 70s gesture, which is to end on a scene of irresolution.
Yeah, well, Melvin Douglas, you're in politics now. Son, you're a politician.
Right.
With that laugh, that Melvin Douglas laugh, and those heralders in the room, and it's just it's amazing.
And a lot of filmmakers like Michael Ritchie, did their best work in the 70s. They sort of felt that they, that was the time they could really explore cinema.
And you've been thinking about this a long time. Now, when you stay on the subject, because I find it interesting, your chapter on Cassavetes is actually one of my favorite things written on Cassavetes, which is saying a lot for me. Because I actually studied with Ray Carney, of all people. Okay? And moreover, helped Ray Carney. I helped Ray Carney on Killing of a Chinese Bookie. I made a shot list of every shot of both versions of that film for him, which taught me actually a lot about that film. And it's a whole other. If you want to, we can go there. But I feel that your one essay on Cassavetes is as good and is interesting. And I was very because you talk about real life and conventions and dialogue, or how people speak to one another. We'll talk about that, because an audience might be interested in this question of writing and screenwriting and point of view.
Well, Cassavetes, I could talk endlessly about Cassavetes. I've taught whole courses on Cassavetes. He's so much fun to talk about. He's so interesting, and he's doing something completely original. You just don't see anybody doing that kind of work, and very few filmmakers are working, in his tradition. Some. But Cassavetes had a really unusual approach to writing and directing. So he was a writer-director, independent. He did make some studio films, but most of his work, and the work that he loved the most of his was always independent, because he called himself a professional actor and an amateur director, and by amateur he meant it in really the most original sense, which is he did it out of love. And so he would write scripts, and and the actors were, if you look at his scripts, they're very close to the movies, even though his movies look like they're improvised. They're not. The actors are saying the lines that they've been given. But he archly refused to tell the actors what to do. So actors would come to him and say, I don't know what you meant by this line. I don't know why I'm saying it.
Yeah.
And he would say, well, if you don't know. He just wouldn't tell them. Peter Falk got so frustrated with him on Husbands.
On Husbands, yeah.
Because he Cassavetes just would not direct him. At least wouldn't direct him in the way that Peter Falk thought a director should. Mm-hmm. And then he saw what was on screen afterwards, and he realized, oh, I see what he was doing. And basically, Cassavetes' approach to writing and directing was, look, I'm going to write the script. I'm going to write the words. You're going to say the words. But you have to figure out why you're saying them.
Oh, interesting.
And just because I wrote it doesn't mean I know what it means. And he would assume that the actors would bring more to the performance if he didn't tell them anything about what his intentions were.
Right.
And so Cassavetes' films are filled with, contradictions and nuances and complexities that you don't find in other cinema, because here you have you have the writer who's the director, but then you have the actors who are doing something totally on their own.
That's right.
And are trying to figure things out, and they're going to bring much more that one person couldn't bring. So you get so many voices in Cassavetes' movies that they feel to people like they're chaos, and yet they're so dense and interesting narratively and characterologically and otherwise.
Well, there is a logic to them, but it's getting to that logic. I mean, for me, they at the end of the day, there is, you can figure out things in them, but they're not readily apparent, on one viewing, perhaps, or they're not.
Yeah, the thing, when I show Cassavetes in class, my students say, well, nothing happened. And I always feel that's weird, because I feel like so much is happening at every instant that I can't keep up.
Well, that's the
thing.
We're
talking about the same thing.
Yeah, because the nothing happens is like too much happening, right? It's like everything.
It's right. It's the same. One thing Ray Carney says in one of his books on Cassavetes, he says something like, Cassavetes scenes go from climax to climax. And I think that's really true. There's just like every 10 seconds there's a climax. Now, you're used to in Hollywood movies that there might be there would be one climax per scene. Defining a climax, say, as something where something changes, where a person changes, or a strategy changes, or a direction changes, or somebody makes a decision to do, instead of doing this, they're going to do that. And, or some revelation, right? Luke discovers his father's Darth Vader. Oh my God, this is crazy, right? And you get one of those a scene. In Cassavetes, they're happening every 4 or 5 seconds.
That's right.
You're just like, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's so exciting if you're into that kind of thing, if you're into that sort of density of storytelling. Cassavetes' movies are so thrilling because you can keep going back and you see a different story every time.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I'm glad that you're showing that in your classes. I often wonder how students respond to some of the films you show, like All That Jazz, or I don't know what you've shown, or Jaws.
I haven't shown All That Jazz. I'm teaching a course on 70s cinema next semester, which is the first time I've done it in, 7 or 8 years. I haven't taught it in a long time.
Yeah.
And my thought was, show some of the outliers, because 70s films are, that period is so full of outliers. Can you think of any of that I should show?
Well, you mean America or Europe?
Hollywood films.
That could be Hollywood films.
Yeah, Hollywood, not indie.
How about Fingers, or how about I don't know. Not
Interesting.
Fingers. Or how about Lipstick?
Lipstick,
but
yeah,
that's an odd one. That the kids like. I don't know. Or I don't know. I'm just thinking. Actually, Man Who Fell to Earth is one of my favorite.
Man Who Fell to Earth. That's a nice idea. Yeah.
Yeah, because
there's so many. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nick Rogue is somebody that people don't write enough about. I don't think he's kind of...
Yeah, and that's interesting. Yeah. Man Who Fell to Earth would be interesting. Yeah, I have on my website even, I have a list of movies from the 70s that are great that people have not seen. and I should try to call it up because there's so many films from that period and they just fell away.
They fell away. Yeah, like the Chocolate Licorice War or things like that. Or,
Yeah, and I'm thinking of, have you seen...
Especially in the early 70s. The
Last of Sheila.
Yeah, I like The Last of Sheila.
Last of Sheila is a brilliant movie. And, of course I love Mikey and Nicky.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite films from the 70s, the Elaine May movie. And North Dallas 40, which was big at the time and then just sort of disappeared.
It's still one of the best football movies.
Absolutely, right.
I think. Yeah, it's interesting, but I'm sure with every class, kids respond in different ways. I guess depending upon the era, depending upon, I'm sure. I sort of feel like back to Cassavetes. Do you think he's had a profound influence on streaming television and indie film currently? He clearly has, right? On Lena Dunham and on people who...
Yeah, not so much, to tell you the truth. He has had an influence. It's often indirect, but there's not a lot of people who are working in that tradition. I would count Mike Leigh as an example.
Very much so.
As a sort of descendant of Cassavetes. But there are not many people who are making that kind of movie. I think his film Shadows, had a really strong impact on the independent filmmaking scene of the 50s and 60s. Yeah. And so there were lots of people who realized from Shadows, you could actually just make a movie. You could pick up a camera, get together a few $1,000s. You could make a movie. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, there are not a whole lot of people that I would say are working in that tradition. Mm-hmm. Elaine May, Martin Scorsese, and a handful of others were fans of Cassavetes. Yep. But most people are doing something different. Mm-hmm. I think maybe Bob Rafelson, mm-hmm. Was working in the 70s, and I think he probably was influenced by Cassavetes. A film like King of Martyr Gardens, it's not exactly a Cassavetes film, but it does have that, strangely surprising density. But it's not like he was, I think when you look at histories of cinema, you don't see, he's not like Francis Ford Coppola or a Martin Scorsese, where you see their influence everywhere.
Interesting. On
American cinema. You don't really see it, you have to trace it with Cassavetes.
I do see it, but I think what you say, I think we're both ready. So I think what you're saying, it hasn't created a school or a thing where you can sort of trace it.
Yeah, or style.
But I definitely see it in what actors do, especially on streaming television. I see things that I feel like would not be possible were it not for Cassavetes.
What do you think of?
Well, Lena Dunham's Girls, for example. A lot of I think actually a lot of it has to do with the time frame that the time frames that quality TV is working with. Like The Sopranos. I think there's a allowance at that time frame of episodic television enables directors and actors to do things that I do think come out of, but not completely, but maybe more indirectly Cassavetes, and I do see traces in that. I don't think people have talked about it much, but I think it is there. I do think it is there.
Yeah. He doesn't appear much in film history textbooks, for one thing. And that might be an oversight, or that might be, the sort of the lack of impact. But he does have a devoted following. You're one, I'm one,
right.
Ray is.
Yeah.
And I know, a lot of them. And there are people who just like me and you, that obsess about him.
Yeah.
But you don't hear him mentioned by filmmakers that often, except for, Martin Scorsese will talk about Cassavetes and his influence. They also had a relationship, and so Scorsese looked at Cassavetes as a mentor.
Absolutely, because especially the influence on not only Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, but Actually, a lot of Cassavetes work. I mean, a lot of Scorsese's films, I see Cassavetes and choices he makes as a director. I'm sure
Mean Streets would be a really good example. In fact, I think you could even attribute Mean Streets to Cassavetes, because Cassavetes. So Scorsese had made the Corman movie. What's that?
The domestic scenes in Raging Bull are totally Cassavetian. The domestic scenes, not the boxing scenes.
Yeah,
to a degree, yes. Very much so.
But it was Cassavetes that encouraged Scorsese to do personal projects like Mean Streets, and that was his. After Cassavetes called Boxcar Bertha a piece of shit, he said, "Don't do that again."
I like Boxcar Bertha. It's a good film.
Yeah, and Scorsese said, "Okay," so he went back. He went and did Mean Streets after that.
That's right. It's interesting. I sort of feel like there's so much we could talk about. I don't want to get too technical or philosophical, but would it be fair to say that you are reacting against the kind of... I think you and I share a philosophic connection, and that I consider myself in part a cognitive neo-formalist. Are you such, or are you come out of that more of that rather than the more esoteric sort of film theory? Or how would you describe your approach? Because I sort of feel like when you talk about films, you actually talk about what happens in the movie without going for reaching or extraneous stuff that doesn't have much to do with what's actually on screen. I appreciate that, but you should probably talk more about that since you...
Well, the way that I think about it is that I'm interested in film aesthetics, which is basically a way of saying I'm interested in why people find movies rewarding or enjoyable or pleasurable or what have you. So I'm interested in film as a kind of, as something that it interacts with your brain. Yeah. And so when you talk about cognitivism, and I have worked, a lot with cognitivist film studies, although I don't really firmly put myself in a cognitivist camp, although I have written pieces that would be in that tradition. My interest is in, everything I write just about is about, what about this movie does something to our brain that our brains like to do. Yep. So the part of that that's cognitive is what's going on in the brain, right? The part of that is not is what's going on in the movie. So, I will look at, maybe narrative properties or stylistic properties or anything sensory that is going to make our brains do something. You can't just sit down and have Casablanca. You have to watch it and listen to it. Well, and you need that stimulus. Yeah, otherwise, your brain isn't going to enjoy it.
Your brains are going to know what to do. I mean, you point out some really interesting, like you say in Hollywood Aesthetic, that part of the enormous appeal of Raging Bull is his expressivist boxing scenes and the strangeness of them. You're saying that those very qualities are what appealed to an audience and made it more I really find that interesting. I mean, I think it's not just a cognitive thing, it's also the formal properties of the film. I do find a lot of your predecessors, especially in the 70s and 80s, a little off-putting because I feel like they do talk about things that aren't in the movie. If you follow what I mean, they make all these very, I don't know, term far out or extraneous points that really have nothing to do with Unforgiven or Casablanca or the movie we're talking about.
Well, I think probably what you're responding to are, these different, there are different strains in film studies. So there's the cognitive strain, and the neo-formalist strains, which are, more in line with the way that you think about movies, the way that I think about movies. As experiences for spectators, meaning, an aesthetic experience is an actual experience. It's an empirical event, and in order to understand it, you need to understand film form if you're talking about cinema, and you also need to understand, what brains in fact do, at least as best as we can understand that. Yeah. And so psychology is one place to understand the response component of aesthetics. The part that I think you're getting frustrated with, and I get frustrated with too, is when people don't take into account, how people actually respond, but they theorize how somebody might respond, or they theorize a meaning in the movie that has nothing to do with how people conceive of the movie. It is merely an interpretation in the sense that it is something they have put on the movie as opposed to something that an audience might discover. So what if you look at the movie this way? And the other strain is, that is probably dominant in film studies right now is cultural studies. So the effort there is not to understand the work as an aesthetic object, but as an expression of culture. It's like a communication studies approach, because it's looking at how culture is communicating its ideas by usually ideologies or politics or what have you, or gender roles or any other sort of cultural construction by means of its artifacts. But that part, I think, misses what you and I most appreciate, which is the artistry. Works of art are not just artifacts of a culture. They are also works of art. And, if you're interested in art, then, that's going to be your primary focus. And it's not as though art is outside of culture. We need to understand an artwork within its cultural history and within its history at large. But that's background to understanding how the work of art functions as a work of art. Now, so what we're arguing over here, not you and I, but with others who take another approach is what's the foreground, what's the background? We put art in the foreground and the rest in the background, whereas some people flip that.
I guess for them it's more about, political activism maybe foremost maybe, rather than the film. That could be one difference.
Yes, well, it's certainly among ideological film scholars, and ideology is perhaps the most common form of film analysis that's being done right now. It's it's not an aesthetic analysis. It's normally a hermeneutic analysis or an interpretive analysis. But aesthetics is not hermeneutics. It's a different activity.
Yeah, it is different. I guess you need both. I guess it all depends on what you're. I don't know. I'm pretty generous. It depends on the kind of class that you're teaching too. If you're teaching a class about, attitudes of artists towards different groups in society, then politics would be very important, I would think. But that would be a certain kind of class, I guess, or a specific kind of class. I don't know. I want to go back to a Hollywood aesthetic because you do some really beautiful things in it. I was really impressed with your reading of Leave Her to Heaven. Well, I'm impressed with the number of things.
I love that movie.
Yeah, it's great. And I sort of wished the book were longer. I'd like to see more chapters, right? I would like to see what you do with different more movies. But talk a little bit about when you approach a movie like Leave Her to Heaven or Touch of Evil. What are you trying to convey in your book or to a class? What are you saying? Look at this or.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm actually showing Leave Her to Heaven in a class on Tuesday.
Excellent.
So, I think, first of all, we should explain to your listeners Leave Her to Heaven, because it's not like Citizen Kane and Casablanca where everybody's heard of the movie if they haven't seen it. Leave Her to Heaven was a 1940s Fox film that was a big success at the time, but was really forgotten afterwards. But it's interesting today to people like me and maybe you and others, because it's you sort of can't believe it got made at all. It's such a strange object. It just doesn't behave in the way that you expect a Hollywood movie to behave. And it's, the main character for this, first of all, this is a 1940s movie, and the main character is this psychopath woman who's a murderer, and yet she's actually, quite interesting and kind of lovely at times. It feels very modern that way because it feels like one of these characters, from like House of Cards or something where they're just evil, but they're interesting. And your protagonist gets kind of mixed up with her, but she's this sort of strangest sort of femme fatale you can imagine, because she doesn't behave like the femme fatales of noir films. Yes, and some people would include this movie among the noir, but but it's also in Technicolor, which is also strange because Technicolor at this time was a format that was normally reserved for big budget spectacles, action films, costume pictures, musicals, not for dark films about, psychopathic murderers. So, this movie has this real, it's a hard movie to get your head around because it's often behaving in a way that seems so strange and unpredictable. I'll tell you something that the producer of the film, Daryl Zanuck, said to describe it. I'm reading here. I was just looking this up while I was talking. Talking about the main character, Zanuck said, she deliberately kills her own unborn child, drowns the crippled brother of her husband, and endeavors to send her own adopted sister to the electric chair. And yet, despite all of this, there are certain things about her that you rather like.
Yeah.
And that's, he's getting at the sort of paradox and contradiction of this movie. But to answer your question, what I look for in films are, what's odd or interesting very often, to see what are the edges. I mean, the fun thing about teaching Hollywood cinema is that, most films are what you would call the normal film. Yeah. But then there are filmmakers who are, and films like Leave It to Heaven, that are sort of working on the outside. Not the outside, but working toward the edges. They never transgress. They never become an art film. Right. Hollywood doesn't make art films, except very rarely. But there are films like Leave It to Heaven and Touch of Evil that are right, they're almost there.
They're right on the edge, especially Touch of Evil and Leave It to Heaven. Yeah, you're right. I mean, they're not Rivette films. They're not out. They're not, or the horror. It's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about Douglas Sirk for some reason. I don't know why it comes to my mind. Do you teach Sirk?
Well, probably because he made Technicolor movies.
Yeah, probably so. Did you want to say anything more about some major films and that are either in your book or outside of your book, or whether it's Godfather or whether it's Goodfellas, which you mentioned, or any of the titles that are in this book? By the way, when you're choosing a film, how do you make a choice of a film, say in this book? Like, what made you choose The Asphalt Jungle, for example? Or is it...
Yeah, so when writing Hollywood Aesthetic, which is the book you're talking about, I wanted to write a book that was at least attempting to be comprehensive. I wanted to write a book that would span, that would say, okay, this is what's normal, this is what's unusual. And I wanted to write a book that was sort of systematic in its approach. So the approach I take in Hollywood Aesthetic is we're going to look at Hollywood films from four different areas: narrative, style, ideology, and genre. And my thought was these four areas will allow me to explore sort of all the aspects of Hollywood cinema that define it as a group. And so when I'm picking a movie to analyze, like The Asphalt Jungle, which appears in the ideology section, I'm finding movies that I think are going to be illustrative of whatever it is about that aspect of Hollywood cinema, in this case ideology, that I think is going to, explain to readers what defines Hollywood cinema and where are the edges. Because that's essentially the project of that book, is to say, okay, this is what defines it, and here's as far as it can go. And here are some examples of as far as it can go. And beyond this, it's not a Hollywood movie anymore. A studio will not fund it because it's not going to appeal to a mass audience. Rivette is not going to appeal to a mass audience. Godard is not going to appeal to a mass audience. The Asphalt Jungle will.
Yeah, it will.
Because it's still tethered to that Hollywood form. But it's exploring those edges. So I'm looking for examples both of normal films, like I also discussed Rocky III.
You did, and I actually really appreciated that, because actually you talked about it, again, more intelligently than the way a lot of sort of, I don't know, ideological critics would talk about it. And you actually get to the heart of the movie and what's going on in that movie,
Yeah, because remember, it takes artists to make Hollywood movies, even routine Hollywood movies like Rocky III. Technicians alone cannot do it. You have to hire artists. They may not be great artists. They may not even be good artists, but they are artists, meaning they are doing something. Their skill is in creativity.
Amen.
You cannot just hire a DP and any old person who can write or whatever. You have to have somebody who knows how to be creative. So even a movie like Rocky III, which I don't like, by the way, I mean, it's disposable. I like it in a way that I might like, anything disposable.
Right. Well, it's I'm
not interested in watching it a bunch of times, like Touch of Evil or Asphalt Jungle.
Well, it's not even The Karate Kid, which is a better movie, or not even.
Yeah, it's not even The Karate Kid. Yeah. So I wanted in the book to explore, the normal. So Love or Come Back, what else? No Time for Sergeant, Tarzan and His Mate. These are normal, the big broadcast. These are normal Hollywood movies. And I wanted the book to sort of define normality. And then I wanted to say, but here are the edges. And I figured that between those two practices, you're going to see what Hollywood is capable of and also what its limitations are.
Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. For you, those limitations, functions are basically intent and style. Like if you're a studio, there's certain things you don't want to do because you're trying to communicate to an X amount of people, a lot of people, right? And so that sort of that kind of is a question of intent, right? Like what's your, that's all part of it. That seems to me pretty straightforward.
Well, the main thing about a Hollywood film, it has to appeal to a mass audience because that's its business model. So it's got to be comprehensible by a mass audience. And if it's not, Hollywood's never going to fund it. Right. I mean, they might accidentally fund it. They might, just fund something and then it turns out that it was not what they thought it was going to be. But they're not going to do it if they think it's not going to have mass appeal. And anything that's unclear or that's shot in a highly unusual form is not going to get funded. And that's why, it's interesting when these outliers appear, when these films that, I sometimes think about writing a book like a sort of how in the hell kind of would be the title or something like, how did this come out of that system? And, like there are movies like Bigger Than Life, and which I don't talk about in the book. And
it's a great film.
Maybe Night in the City, or others that you just like. How did this movie get funded by a major studio?
And is that a function of just the business economics of Hollywood that sometimes highly original things just get through? It happens.
That's the mystery. That's what Andre Bazin called the genius of the system. That, despite the fact that they make Hollywood movies in a way that is somewhat similar to how car manufacturers make cars.
Interesting.
In this, assembly line format, that despite all that, you've got Casablanca, and you have the Asphalt Jungle and Leave It to Heaven and Unforgiven, and like these really great movies. Some of the great works of art of the 20th century and sometimes in the 21st century, and yet they came out of a system that would not seem conducive. Orson Welles said the enemy of art is the absence of limitations.
He's right.
And
actually, Stravinsky said the same thing.
What did Stravinsky say?
Well, Stravinsky said that you have to have a strictness of some kind of form. Yeah. In order for me to even begin composing.
Exactly, because the classical form inspires creativity. And that's how Dickens wrote novels in a serial format. It's one of the most restricted formats for writing a novel. You can't write Ulysses that way, but you can you could write Oliver Twist.
Sure.
Right? And Shakespeare also worked in a highly constrained format, a Renaissance stage. And yet, you can't do, Samuel Beckett, but you can do Hamlet.
You do Hamlet.
Right?
Let me ask you a question about teaching. It occurs to me that I'm wondering, I'm sure you've had students, even though today, I guess students I understand are rather sophisticated. They've seen everything and maybe not. I don't know. You would know better, of course, because you teach. Have you ever had a moment where somebody was really unfamiliar with something really great? Like, say, a Citizen Kane, or She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. I don't know, How Green Was My Valley, or something like that, or Asphalt Jungle, and they'd never seen it before. They never had Turner Classic Movies, and it just blows their mind. Have you had experiences like that where students have seen something and been knocked out by it?
Every class.
Every class.
Yeah. Students have not seen these movies. I do an exercise on the first. So I teach the intro once a year or so. I teach Intro to Film Studies, which is at my university, which is University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
Yep.
We, to become a film studies major, you have to do well in this intro class. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of high stakes class for students. Oh, yeah. And on the first day of class, I say, I put up a slide, but, before I've even lectured, just as they're sitting down, I put up a slide, and the slide says, take out a piece of paper and write down the 5 best movies ever made.
That's tough.
And then, so I put that aside, and then, sometime that day, I say, okay, take out your list. Now, cross off every movie that's in English. And I say, how many people have any movies left? And maybe, out of the class, maybe 20% have any movies left. And I say, okay, now cross out every movie that was made during your lifetime. And my kids, my students are like 20 years old. So, and I say, okay, now how many movies are left on your list? And there's usually just a handful, right? And this class might have over 100 students. And
so these students aren't automatically writing Pickpocket or Andrei Rublev, or they're not doing that, right?
They're not. Yeah. They don't know. They love movies, but they only know what they know.
Right.
And, it would be quite a coincidence, wouldn't it? If the 5 best movies ever made were made in my student's lifetime in English. That would be weird.
Yeah, it would.
And so my job there, and I tell them this, is my job is to expand that list so that you get exposed to things you don't know. One thing, last semester, a student said, I can't really relate to many of the films you showed in this class. And I said, that's great. That's exactly what I'm going for. Mm-hmm. I want to show you movies you cannot relate to, because I need to expand your horizons and expand the things that you can relate to. And cinema is a good way to do that.
What's an example of a film that would expand a kid's mind? That, just any film that comes into your consciousness, this film, bigger than life, or would it be Fat?
Well, Playtime. The Jacques Tati movie. Yeah. Who knew such a movie could ever be made?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Probably your listeners haven't seen it, but it's one of the great works of art of the 20th century, and it's Jacques Tati. It's almost unwatchable. It's so strange. It's so hard to watch.
Well, it is. It is funny though. You don't think
it's funny, yes, and he thought it would be a big success in the U.S. That's why he gave it an English title. But it went so far, and I mean, I'm not really giving your listeners a sense of what it is because it's such a strange movie. But it's perceptually very difficult just to keep your eyes on it because there's so much going on in every frame. Yeah. But that's a movie that my students hate it, and then there's a handful that love it.
Really,
which is what I'm going for. If most of the students hate it, but some of them love it, I think that was a good pick. I'll show Stan Brackage's Window Water Baby movie.
Oh wow.
Some students hate it, some students love it.
Now, do the students that hate that particular movie, is it because they have certain beliefs about what should be shown in a film or not shown? Is it more of a prosaic nature, or is it the overall
Oh, that's
film.
interesting. Yeah, that's actually, some of it is exactly that. They think this is not, I've had a student, when I get comments, I get student evaluation at the end of the semester. They remark more on that movie than any other. And one student did say, this is not art. And then another student said, show it every class meeting before class. It's a polarizing film, but I think students find it disgusting. It depicts the birth of Stan Bracken's first child.
Right.
So, in the 1950s, by the way, before men did that.
You can't get more interesting than that. But
it's certainly interesting. So, but these are films that they blow my students away. I showed, getting back to 70s movies, I showed a few years ago. I showed the Brian De Palma film Phantom of the Paradise.
Oh wow,
1974 Brian De Palma film, and nobody in the class had seen it, and one of my students decided that was his favorite movie. He just decided this is my favorite movie.
Yeah.
And it's one of those 70s outliers that we were talking about.
Absolutely. Well, maybe most of De Palma's movies are outliers, even though they adhere so closely to genre and Hitchcock and conventions. They're still all kind of unusual when you say body double.
Yeah, well, he could go either way. He could do Sisters, but he could do Carrie, and he could do the Untouchables.
Carrie's a little bit unusual. I don't think that's.
Yeah, it is a little unusual, but it's pretty. I mean, in some ways, it's set a formula, but it's also following a formula. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not as unusual as
Sisters.
Sisters or Phantom of the Paradise.
Yeah. That's something. What do you account for the extraordinary popularity of certain movies, whether it's Titanic or Scarface? Movies that are kind of, I don't know I guess they're, I'm sure you thought a lot about this. I think there are some movies that are just insanely popular because of the actual qualities of the film. They just move people. And I'm sure that's a thing. But then there are other films that may not be the reason. It may be something else. It's interesting, right? Sort of beloved films.
Well, yeah. If you could answer that question, and I could answer that question, we'd be rich.
That's right.
It's very hard to predict what's going to be a hugely popular success. But a movie like Titanic has kind of all the elements of huge success, meaning it's a well-made film, which we could talk about what that means, but it's a well-made film that also is designed to appeal to multiple demographics.
Right.
So the way that, sort of one of the big differences between Hollywood today and Hollywood, say, of the studio era or of the 70s even, which is after the studio era, is, movies today have gotten so expensive and to make and to distribute that most studios are looking for huge blockbuster successes, and the only way to do that is to appeal to multiple audiences. A film like Asphalt Jungle, say, or Leave It to Heaven, well, Leave It to Heaven is a little bit different, but Asphalt Jungle, it's designed, it's not going to appeal to huge numbers of people. It's going to appeal to people who like that kind of movie. But a movie like Titanic, it's got love story, it's got disaster film, it's got a lot of action, it's got big stars, it's got sexuality, it's got lots of things going for it that are going to have mainstream appeal. And if you're a talented filmmaker, or at least a good filmmaker like Cameron is, then you're going to be able to pull all that together and make it feel like a coherent whole. And it's to...
So that when you talk about well-made, that's what you mean. You're talking about a certain kind of craft-like quality to be able to do.
Yeah, craft and creativity. It's not, Cameron's an artist. He's not a technician. People want to consider people like Cameron, merely technical filmmakers, but they're artists too. They may not have the boldness and novelty of a
Terrence Malick,
Tati, but they are also artists, and you need them to make movies, even mainstream movies like Titanic.
Yeah.
You know, Spielberg's a good example. I mean, he's extremely creative. He's extremely talented.
Yeah.
But a lot of the film scholars I know, you know, poo-poo him because his movies are mainstream. They're designed to appeal to mass audiences.
Well, Spielberg, from my point of view, is a very inconsistent filmmaker. Sometimes he makes really, really great films, and then other times movies that aren't so great. So I think maybe it's just his inconsistent. To me, his inconsistency is maybe.
I know, but can you name a filmmaker who doesn't do that? I mean, that's just what an artist is.
Right. That's true.
You know,
that's true.
It's just sometimes you knock it out of the park, and sometimes you try to knock it out of the park, and it doesn't get very far. Yeah. And sometimes you don't even try. You know, it's hard. I mean, Scorsese, you can say the same thing about Scorsese too.
Yeah,
he's got
recently,
some brilliant movies, or Woody Allen, who's got some brilliant movies. But you know, if you can make a brilliant movie, that's pretty good. Well, most people can't.
Yeah, but in the case of Spielberg, the good ones are really good. So I think it's the gap. I think it's the width, the breadth of the gap is interesting. Like if you think about a movie like Close Encounters or E.T., or Jaws. I mean, they really sort of stand out. They just seem different than the other ones. Different than the other ones.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, you know, you're going to have some stinkers. You know, Robert Altman made a lot of stinkers too, but he also made Nashville.
Do you think A Wedding is a stinker?
A Wedding. Oh God, I've only seen it once.
Show in your 70s. Yeah, as A Wedding.
Yeah, I think I liked that movie, if I remember right. I didn't like it enough to go back and see it again, but I think I liked it when I did.
It's one of my favorite Altman movies alongside.
Is it really?
Alongside Long Goodbye. And
you know, and I mean, even more recently, he had made Gosford Park, which was one of his most brilliant movies. But he also made Popeye, and you know, it's you know, sometimes you do it.
Yeah, so you like Gosford Park a lot, don't you? And you like
I do.
And you like Unforgiven a lot.
Yeah, I remember watching Gosford Park, and I was halfway through it, and I was watching it with my mother, and we were in the theater, and in Westwood, I think, in L.A., and I said to her, the movie was not done. We were halfway through, and I said, I want to see this movie again.
Yeah,
I was enjoying it so much that I knew it would reward multiple viewings.
Yep. Altman's an interesting filmmaker, isn't he? I mean, his level of social satire, but also his compassion. I mean, one of the things about him is how he blends the two. It's quite unusual. It's quite unusual that he does that. That's one of the things.
And he would refuse to repeat himself. I mean, you could find tourist tendencies in him, you know, things that he does, like the multiple track recording and improvisation and mumbled dialogue and things like that. But he, you know, after he made MASH, which made him a huge, you know, name director, studios just kept financing his project because they thought maybe he'll make MASH again, and he would not do it. He just insisted on experimenting.
Boy, did he ever! I think after that he does the Bud Cort, right? The
right, the flying kid.
Yeah,
what's his?
Which is one of
I want to say Birdman, but
it's actually it's one of Altman's weirdest movies. That's
it's a strange
Brewster
movie.
McCloud,
right? Yeah. Not Birdman. Yeah. But then he comes out with Long Goodbye, which is just lovely, and Nashville, which is also lovely, and Three Women. There's another outlier. Yeah. So he's trying on Bergman. You know, he says, well, what if I do this? So he's really lovely because, you know, a lot of the most interesting filmmakers were experimenters. They just wanted to keep trying something new.
I'm impressed that you show Stan Brakhage in your class. I did not know. Hear me just reading from these books. I would think you were just teaching, you know, Goodfellas and teaching.
Teach Hollywood.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, well, I teach Hollywood cinema. I'm teaching a course right now in the studio era,
Right.
but I teach other things too.
Mm-hmm.
So my scholarship is almost all about Hollywood cinema, although I do write on some general issues of narrative and style and continuity editing and other things. But in my classes, I try to go broader than that. To expose my students and myself to other film traditions than the American tradition.
Where do you, when you look outside of the class to what's happening in Hollywood studios today, or what's just happening in film over the past, 20, 30 years, and what do you see, and what's your? I know that's a big question because there's a lot going on. I mean, are there trends in film language or style or audio or sound or acting that you find noteworthy, that are unusual or different, or is it what do you make of what's going on?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say, and I don't think I'm certainly not alone in saying this, but Hollywood is not doing very good work today. This is not a really good period for Hollywood. And when I say this period, I'm talking about basically the 21st century.
Right.
It has not been a period of fertility for Hollywood in the way that it was, say, in the 1940s or the 1970s or the 1990s.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but these days, Hollywood is now wedded to a business model that is not really conducive, and it's partly what we've discussed about, which is the model is, appeal to the most number of people. As opposed to appeal to niche audiences. When movies were comparatively inexpensive to make, you could appeal to a niche audience, but filmmakers who want to work in Hollywood at least can't do that. So you have to work either outside of Hollywood, which means independent filmmaking, which is also in a very bad way right now, or television, which is in a very good way right now.
That's interesting.
But, the interesting films are coming out of other countries. Yeah. There's good cinema going on now. It's just not coming out of Hollywood.
Yeah,
and there's good TV coming out of Hollywood, or at least out of the mainstream television industry. Although I'm finding that television is that the golden age, as we've called it, of TV, which is, basically the last 20 years or so, you can see it starting to fade because shows are getting the TV series are getting very bloated, I think. They're things that should have been and would have been 4 episodes are now 10 episodes. And so they're getting kind of tired.
Yeah, there's some of that. I agree with that. It's interesting. I think the energy in a culture goes into different mediums, right? So I guess you could be in an era in which poetry is king, possibly.
Right.
I mean,
that would have been Renaissance England.
Renaissance, or you could be in an era. I just pulled that out of a hat. I mean, an era. You could be in an area in which moving images are the thing, or music, or maybe you could be in an area in which many mediums are flourishing. I don't know, but it seems to me that only natural that these things change with time, and that seems like to me.
And it's not all just natural too. It's also designed that way. So I think a lot of good artists are going to television. Moving image artists. So I'm talking about writers in particular, but also directors and others, but mostly writers, because they know they have more control in television than they do in movies. So they can actually run the show if you're the writer, and you can have some assurance that the writing is going to make it to the screen. Whereas in TV, you really don't have, in movies, you don't have, that kind of assurance.
Well, that's I think that's why streaming television has been so noteworthy, I mean, it's even a little show like Glow, which I really like, that has 70s influences all over it. I don't know if you've seen Glow.
Does it? Yeah. Is that the one about the wrestlers?
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. I mean, there's a lot of, or Julia Child, Mel Mayron's new show is very good about Julia Child. And there's a lot of stuff there, but I just sort of feel like, that's kind of where the energy went. and went to the.
Yeah, the creative energy. You mean? Yeah, I hear you. I think you're right. I think a lot of the talent has gone in that direction because you can do more interesting things, more unusual things that TV really can't, that movies really can't do. The other thing about TV that is special, when compared to movies is, movies you've got 2 hours approximately, and how well can you get to know your characters? But when you have TV shows like Better Call Saul, and that where there are multiple seasons,
yeah, they are.
The writers start to explore character in a way, or at least they can, in a way that is really quite interesting.
Absolutely.
Because they know the audience knows these characters very well. So if the character does something out of character, say, the audience will say, I wonder what's going on, as opposed to, oh, I guess that's who this person is, or, oh, they must have made this character doesn't make sense. It becomes, you start to trust that the character has a whole, and so when they do something out of character or unusual, or they say something in a weird way, you notice it. So there's a tremendous amount of subtlety you can get away with television, because the audience knows the character so well.
Yeah, that's one advantage built into the form, is what you're saying, right? It's kind of a possibility built into the form.
The advantage of movies, of course, is you can get in and get out. There's something kind of lovely about that, the cleanness of that. You can get in and get out. And, so I still tend toward movies, even though I think today television's, at least mainstream television is doing much more interesting things. I still, my heart goes back to movies because I love the way in which it's not ongoing. Of course, movies now are sometimes borrowing that episodic format that TV popularized, but that's still not most movies. That's still just the series films that are so popular.
Do you mind naming a couple movie titles that are, again, I'm sure this is asked of you by many people, that are kind of unknown or not celebrated or reviled, that a la Ishtar you think should be reconsidered and liked, that aren't, or what, any titles that come to mind?
Sort of forgotten.
Well,
movies.
not only forgotten, but also reviled. We're like, the critics were clearly wrong. This movie's a great movie, and unfairly maligned.
There's one I talked about in Hollywood Incoherent. I'm sorry, in Hollywood Aesthetic.
Starship Troopers.
Starship Troopers. Starship Troopers is one of the most brilliant science fiction movies I've ever seen, and it was blasted when it came out. There's been a kind of effort to rejuvenate, its reputation among some commentators, but for the most part, it's still considered like a fascist movie and a straightforward sci-fi film, but it's brilliant and it's strange, and it does things that I've never seen a movie do. Any movie.
Well, your reading of it is unusual, but you do stick to what's in the movie, and you do make a case for it. I mean, I feel.
Yeah, I don't think it's unusual, but maybe that's me.
What I mean is, you're saying the film is unusual for one thing, but also, it's unusual from my point of view, and it's the way I've looked at it. But so I've reconsidered that movie now, having read that, and I sort of feel like the movie that emerges from your pages is very much a very sophisticated social satire, political satire.
On the one hand,
people...
right. And I mean, the thing I love about that movie, and the thing that made me want to write about it, is it does not have a coherent center.
I see.
It is a social satire on the one hand. I mean, it's a war film and an anti-war film, and how do you get away with that? I mean, the only other movie I can think of that you can say that about is Patton.
Yeah, that's right.
Another 70s movie.
That's right.
But try to write a war movie that's an anti-war movie. Both. And not a fake war movie, but a real war movie, like a movie that is celebrating war, but that is also satirizing the celebration of war. So it's got a lot, and that's just one of the things that's going on in that movie. I call the movie perverse because it's turned the wrong way.
Yeah,
but there's all sorts of movies
I should tell the audience that you use words in a special way. In your books, you use words like perverse and incoherent as terms of praise. Often that these are virtues of the films. Often you're talking.
Yeah, I know that's
special. You want to talk about your kind of like the way you use abduction in there. They talk about the abduction of certain things.
That's not my word. So that's actually a term from philosophy. But incoherence. So I use incoherence in Hollywood Incoherent. I use incoherence. So I think of incoherence. Well, a snowball is coherent, right? Everything is sticking together. Something that's incoherent is things are not sticking together, right? They're kind of falling apart, like a drawer full of knickknacks, right? Is incoherent. So I don't mean it in the sort of figurative sense of it doesn't make any sense, although sometimes that you can, that is how I use it. But I really need it in the literal sense of things aren't sticking together. Something's going over here and something's over here, and you cannot find a place where they can exist in the same structure.
Some of us think that that's what our life is actually like, at least in the real world. But anyhow, go ahead. That's probably
so. Hollywood Incoherent is about how this way of making movies, this incoherence within movies was strangely popular for less than a decade. And then in that book and also in Hollywood Aesthetic, I use the term perverse to mean, so perverse literally means turn the wrong way. Perverse. So verse means turn and
wrong way around.
And per is, wrong way. So perverse. And I think of that as, it's related to incoherence in that there's something that is sort of sticking out, something that is not facing the right direction. So we tend to use the term perverse in the moral sense, which is somebody who's morally perverse if they're like a child molester or something like that. But I don't mean it that way. I just mean that it's something that can be in morality quite wrong and antisocial is in the artistic realm a virtue, because we often come back to artworks. We find them interesting and challenging and novel and unorthodox when they are somehow turned the wrong way. And I think Starship Troopers is a good example of a movie that's turned the wrong way. It seems to be heading in one direction, and then all of a sudden you find yourself someplace you'd never expected to be.
Right. Well, I mean, you talk a lot about finding the happy medium or balance between giving your brain something to do to figure something out, and being bored by interminable repetition. And it's interesting. But you also say in this book, you make it clear about current audiences that their appetite for puzzles is much higher, and you seem to imply that they crave or want more puzzles in films than they used to. Is this true?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm speculating there, but I what I'm seeing is that there is an appetite for puzzle films at the narrative level.
That's right.
At the stylistic level, people are still pretty conservative. They want the familiar style, but meaning they want shot reverse shot. They want the camera to frame the action in the center of the frame. They things like that. People aren't. Filmmakers, at least working in the mainstream tradition, aren't really working with unusual styles. When Hollywood experiments, it's usually at the level of stories.
That's right.
It's telling unusual stories. But there seems to be an appetite in the 21st century, and it began in the 40s, you could say, but it got really intense, in the 90s and then beyond, for movies that are puzzles that. You need to see them several times. Even a filmmaker, like a mainstream filmmaker like Christopher Nolan, is making movies that are real puzzle films that he wants you to watch again and try to work on them and figure them out because they're not so straightforward. And I think that may be, and I'm speculating there, that may be a factor of people's just familiarity with classical storytelling. That they get bored with it because it's too straightforward, and they say, show me something I haven't seen. Show me something that's going to make me work a little bit. I think one of the, central beliefs in all my aesthetic analysis is that people get bored. You go to artworks to work.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not working, you're bored. And, we think of art as escapist, and it is, but it's escapism of a particular sort where you're actually doing something with your brain. You're not just couch potatoing. Right. You are thinking. And if you're not thinking, you're tuned out. Right. It's just background noise. Mm-hmm. But if you're engaged, you're working. Mm-hmm. And I think people, by all accounts, people are engaged by Hollywood movies. They're cheering. They're jumping out of their seats. They're standing in line. They're weeping. They're screaming. Mm-hmm. It's not like they're just sitting there watching passively. People love Hollywood movies, so they must be working. So my effort in that book is to say, well, what are you doing? What work is the movie making you do?
Yeah, what is the work? How does this work, Ray? So do you mind talking to the audience about analytic philosophy and abduction? You want to talk about getting with that guy using that?
Are you sure you want to go there, Mitch?
Sure.
It's heady stuff.
It is, yeah.
So, all right. So the concept of abduction, which is not stealing children in philosophy, the concept of abduction comes from Charles Peirce. Right. I don't know if he originated it.
I have read Peirce.
Well, yeah. So he certainly, investigated it. The idea is that there are different types of reasoning. So the two most common forms of reasoning are deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is what's called strict logic or crisp logic. That's, 2 + 2 = 4. There's no way for it not to be. You don't need to prove it by looking at examples. It is true according to deductive reasoning, which is crisp logic. Mm-hmm. So logicians work and mathematicians work deductively. Scientists work inductively. Inductive reasoning is making observations and drawing conclusions. So a good scientist uses scrutiny. They observe the world, or they set up an experiment. They make a prediction. They see what the results are. And then they induce a conclusion based on those results. Mm-hmm. And it's reliable to a certain degree, but it's not perfectly reliable like deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is perfect. Inductive reasoning is imperfect, which is why science is constantly improving. The cures, the treatments for heart disease and cancer are getting better and better because induction is a process of scrutiny and observation, etc. Peirce talks about this other type of reasoning, which is abduction. Abduction is basically a guess. You're presented with information, you're like, well, maybe it's this. And it can just sort of pop into your head, or you might, work at it for a while. Right. So if you're looking at an anagram, for instance, or, you might use abduction. You're not going to use deduction. It's not going to work. Mm-hmm. You could use induction, but it would take forever. Yeah. But abduction, you could just glance at it and say, oh, this is fishmonger, right? But all the words are you just sort of, it pops into your head and you take a guess, and maybe you got some letters wrong. Maybe it isn't fishmonger. Maybe it's something like fishmonger. But you did your best, and it was a moment of imagination, of insight, of inspiration, and you don't know when it's going to come, but you just it just hits you. Mm-hmm. Narratives require abduction. You're mostly just making guesses. You're observing, you're using scrutiny. You're not using deductive except, rarely. Mm-hmm. But you're basically, the filmmakers are cueing you to make guesses all the time. And that process is enjoyable. Because it's imaginative, and your brain likes to engage in imaginative activity. And this is the primary work, or maybe one of the primary, if not the primary work, of observing art, which is you something hits you and you're coming to conclusions and you're making guesses, and maybe they're not logical. Abduction is prone to error, right? If you're using abductive reasoning, you're just as likely to be wrong as right. But it is a type of reasoning. You may be wrong, but you did engage in that cognitive activity, and artwork spur that activity, and that's one of the reasons we enjoy them.
We enjoy the very fact that it's not those other kinds of reasoning.
That's right, because the stakes are low.
Yeah, right? Low stakes.
If you're wrong, it doesn't matter.
I sort of feel like doing Banned Books Week, which is now, right? I sort of feel like everybody should read your chapter about the low stakes. People have an artificially high view of the stakes in art. They think it's
the stakes of art.
They think it's happening in the real
world. Low.
Yeah. Talk about that.
It's not like sending somebody to the moon. If you're wrong, if you use abductive reasoning to send somebody to the moon, you're going to get in trouble. But you can use it when you're watching The Godfather and nobody's going to care.
Right. That's the thing, the lower stakes. I've really enjoyed discussing these things with you. There's a lot to movies are popping into my head. How about showing them Girlfriends by Claudia Lau in your 70s class?
Oh, man, I haven't seen that in a long time. Yeah, I don't know. Girlfriend, that's a good idea. Yeah, I'm thinking I might show Sorcerer, which is a William Friedkin movie that it's not really remembered. It was based on a Clouseau movie you've probably seen called Wages of Fear, and it's a really good remake.
Yes.
So that's an option too. But or Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. You've probably seen that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the early Michael Cimino movie before Deer Hunter, before Heaven's Gate, and he made a really good caper movie.
Yeah,
Thunderbolt Night.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's all Fat City.
And Fat City. Yeah, Fat City's a lovely boxing movie.
There's a lot of movies.
Yeah, it's a brilliant period.
Is there anything else you want to say before because even good things like this come to an end, right? So what do you want to, comes into your consciousness that you want to share with the audience? Maybe a word on the word aesthetic itself. What do people mean when they say aesthetic? What is that?
Yeah, if I could define it in a way that everybody would agree, I'd be the most famous philosopher of aesthetics of all time. So aesthetics is one of those contested terms, but I think if philosophers of aesthetics agree on anything, which they don't, it would be on this. First, it involves some sensory stimulation. It's not just thinking. You can't daydream and have an aesthetic experience. It has to be an object that you are perceiving.
Okay.
And two, it's not just sensory, right? Because sensory pleasures are passive, right? Like eating ice cream, you don't have to think to enjoy it. But in artwork or nature, if you're enjoying it aesthetically, there's some thought engaged.
Exactly.
But that's not enough either. There has to be a third thing, and this is where the philosophers get really, where the controversies erupt, which is appreciation, or some people call it sensitivity, or taste, or discrimination, or evaluation.
Right.
It's that third thing that people can agree on when it comes to what is aesthetics. But really, I think we could say if aesthetics is anything, there are also philosophers who don't think it's anything. They think it's an incoherent concept. But I think when we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about some work of art or nature or some object that you're appreciating that gives you sensory pleasure, but also gives you intellectual pleasure. But there's also this meta quality where you're like, you say to yourself, that was good. I really like that. Where you think of it as a work of art.
I see. Well, I was fortunate to have Blake, the man who wrote the Warhol biography, the big Warhol, Blake Gottnick, on the show.
Oh, nice. Yeah, good for you.
Well, it was an interesting conversation because he subscribes very much to this very abstract view of aesthetics, of Noé's view that it's a meta view. He really does think art is about art, I think. I don't want to speak for him, but he was very much of the last thing you said, that you're being aware of something as a work of art is for him, I think, indispensable. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how I feel about that. I'm on the fence. That's a very, because it's a strong claim to me. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but that's
Well, there are aesthetic philosophers who would agree with him, and the other area that aesthetics operates in, the primary area, is nature. So, but there are some aesthetic philosophers that say when you appreciate art aesthetically, you're treating nature as though it's a work of art.
interesting. Yeah.
And so some people think that aesthetics is the domain of art. At the very least, there are many who would say that when it comes to aesthetic experience, art is really good at giving it. That's the only thing that art consistently gives us. And that if it doesn't give us that, we don't even consider it, worthy of anything. It could be socially valuable, economically valuable, sexually valuable, whatever. None of those things tell us that it's a good artwork. The only thing, again, according to some philosophers, like Dom Lopez, would say, that if there is any artistic value, it is only aesthetic value.
Interesting. Well, that's a view that you're not going to say, will you weigh in on any of that, or or how do you?
I'm out of my league. I'm already out of my league.
Okay.
Just defining aesthetics. This is, there are many minds since Aristotle that have tried to do this, and bigger philosophical minds than mine have failed.
I, of course, didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I felt you were up to it, and you were. That was very, very helpful.
Well, I did the best I could, but I'm really an amateur there. As I say in Hollywood Aesthetic, I take a pluralistic approach. I'm not going to try to settle these controversies in aesthetic because I'm totally unqualified to do that. But I do know that that a lot of these aesthetic philosophers can help us understand how artworks work, and so I want to make sure to use them in this pluralistic way so that I don't ignore all that learning.
Well, you teach at UNC, and you're going to be teaching on Tuesday, and I'm excited that you're doing that, and I hope you have a good class, and I hope you have a good semester.
Well, thank you so much. UNC Wilmington, not UNC Chapel Hill. I teach at UNC Wilmington. So just so your listeners know that.
Very important. And thanks for being on our show. And if you have any,
thank you so much.
Anything else you want to add? Now is the time.
No, I think we're good. I think we tested the patience of your listeners.
I think we did. Thank you very much, Todd.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye.
I don't like goodbyes, so I'll see you soon, folks. Thank you.